będzie przemawiał.
Ja tutaj będę wprowadzał, a teraz pytanie jest takie, czy ksiądz chce mówić stąd, czy siedząc?
Nie, to ojciec mi powie, to ja, jaki jest zwyczaj.
Nie, to każdy wybiera jak woli. Jak ktoś ma takie bardziej większe zacięcie, normalnie to ksiądz się nie środku. Ale ja będę tam. Nie, tam to już pasy dobrze, przygotowane. Aha. Ja mu wtedy pomagam. To może tu położyć.
Grazie.
Greetings to everyone with us. On behalf of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, I would like to welcome you to the last lecture of the GP2 lectures this academic year. This series is organized by the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, which is part of our Faculty of Philosophy here at the Angelicum in Rome. This lecture, as well as the entire GP2 lecture series, could not have taken place without the support of our university authorities, Father Thomas Joseph White, Director of Angelicum, and the Father Serge Thomas Bonino, the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, whom I would like to thank. Special thanks are also in order for the founders of St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, donors and supporters of the Institute, our audience and all viewers in front of their screens. The St. John Paul II Institute of Culture was established to look at the challenges facing the modern world and the Church in light of the life and thought of St. John Paul II. The idea of thinking with John Paul II has been embodied in the GP2 lecture series, which are monthly lectures of eminent interdisciplinary academics who will revisit the extraordinary contribution of John Paul II for our own day. It is my honor to introduce to you Reverend Franciszek Longchamp de Brie, Professor of Law and the head of the Department of Roman Law at the Faculty of Law and Administration of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He also teaches at the Faculty of Law and Administration of the University of Warsaw. He has an LLM from Georgetown University. He is a Catholic priest and expert on bioethics for the Polish Episcopal Conference, as well as a member of the Commerce Legal Affairs Commission. He has also been elected to the Committee of Legal Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He researches in the fields of Roman and civil law, legal history, European legal tradition, law of succession, methodology of private law, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion in US law. In his lecture titled Hominum Causa, All Law is Established for Man's Sake, and the Dispute on the Essence of Man, Professor Longchamp de Brie will explore the anthropological significance of referring law to man, which would appear to be universal. The relationship between man and law makes law a meaningful tool for the realization of human values and for serving man as an existing being prior to law. This relationship also points to man as a person, and so to the fact that this later relationship that between homo and persona is a uniquely long overdue. Professor Longchamp de Berrier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored by the invitation and this possibility to be here and to speak about law, in fact, although you concentrate more on philosophy, but there are links between law and philosophy, so thank you for having a lawyer here. I prepared a presentation. Of course, we have this series of lectures, JP2 lectures, thinking with John Paul II. So special thanks to our sponsors, special thanks to the university, and also to the entire foundation, and to Teologia Polityczna, and to Dariusz Karłowicz for this inspiration. He always tried to convince us that especially our generation is responsible and so that is our generational responsibility, to think with John Paul II. I propose to think in terms of law a little bit. So this is why I prepared this lecture about dispute on the essence of man, hominum causa. So thank you for having a lawyer here. We are in Rome, and I teach Roman law back in Poland. So for someone who teaches Roman law, is supposed to be a natural ambiance to be here at also at Angelicum, here at this hill where everything started for Roman law. But law is also a part of culture. We prepared this year with the help of Routledge editors and with Emory University from Atlanta, this book that is a part of a series of books about law and Christianity through lives of Christian jurists, of great jurists. And in fact, we prepared that book about Poland, having 20 chapters in this book. And one of the chapters is about Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II. That was written by editor Rafael Domingo, Professor Rafael Domingo, who is professor also of Roman law. We have also a chapter about a person who spoke about John Paul II here, our first ambassador to the Holy See, Professor Henryk Kupiszewski. His last speech, in fact, was a speech here at Angelicum. Law is a part of human nature, human culture. Law makes culture, so I'm particularly grateful for inviting me as a lawyer here to think with St. John Paul II. Therefore, we start. One very special concept which Roman law introduced not only to our legal tradition, but to our entire culture, is that of persona. We see how individualistic it is when we compare it to the Greek notion of polis, that is an urban society to which individuals were definitely subordinated. John Paul II pointed in 1991 that, quote, as history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. The experience of the enormous change in political systems which took place in the late 20th century Europe led the author of this observation to further comment, quote, authentic democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law and on the basis of a correct conception of the human person, unquote. The first part of this last citation is best known and often repeated. It is the second, however, that touches the main problem of our times, that is anthropology. How should one respect human beings as bearers of rights? Is there any correct anthropology, the only correct anthropology to be used as a basis for law? The experience of discussions with Marxists before 1991 could be instructive with regard to the challenges that any concept of persona and or individual and or barrier of rights has to confront in present times. And by contrast with this, the jurisprudential framework of Roman law could provide a useful, independent perspective on this issue. This is why we take this perspective here. So the main problem of our times is anthropology, as we think about the basis of a correct conception of the human person. The title is Hominum Causa. The maxim of the Roman jurist Hominum Causa omne jus constitutum sit has various possible translations. Commonly, all law has been established on account of mankind, or even every law needs to be created for the sake of man. So in fact, we have the citation here for two reasons. That this sentence of Hermogenianus, a pagan lawyer, jurist, because this is also the part of the discussion about our book, that in English there is a distinction between lawyer and jurist. We don't use it, for example, in Polish, and I don't consider myself as a law professor only a jurist. I think we are lawyers, and we should be lawyers, and we should consider ourselves lawyers. But this concept of a jurist makes also jurists those who are important for law. That is like Alfonso, the king of Spain, or Justinian, who was not a jurist, but he's very important for law and for our European tradition. This is why we included also John Paul II. But he was not a lawyer in the sense of his preparation. He was a philosopher. He got his degree here in this room. But twice he mentioned that Roman pagan jurist. He mentioned him twice in two particular, very special places. These places are Polish Parliament. In fact, this is National Assembly of Poland, that is the lower house and the Senate together in Warsaw on the 11th of June 1999, but also here. That might be considered even more revolutionary, because the meeting with Italian Parliament, representatives of the Republic of Italy, meeting with the Pope of Rome. And also here he mentioned hominum causa omne jus constitutum est, or omne jus constitutum sit. Present tense for law is important. The main question, however, is not about the denotation or translation of this precept, but what anthropological questions arise when Hermogenianus' precept is recalled at the turn of the 21st century. A maxim from a Roman lawyer and an observation from a modern pope both advert to wisdom that is conveyed by legal culture and hence to the history of law and European civilization. Either of the sentences quoted can be read as a statement or a hypothesis, but also as a norm or a command. Each implicitly carries core values and at least two assessments. A positive assessment is expressed by the hominum causa in relation to what affirms and serves man, while a negative evaluation runs through the phrases a democracy without values and turns into totalitarianism. The sentences in question, combination of these two quotations, both from John Paul II, but in fact John Paul II and pagan jurist. The sentences in question come from different areas and from different eras, but from the same civilization. One formulated by a Roman jurist and the other by a Roman pope. Significantly, the latter though not a lawyer by training, harkened back to the universal-sounding thought of a long-since dead pagan jurist. So it seems that Hermogenianus' observation expresses an enduring concept of the human person possessing the authority of the centuries and in contradiction to the 20th century totalitarianism. So, of course, we can ask about the methodology, because did really, and what really meant John Paul II when he mentioned hominum causa constitutum sit? What is his own and what is related to his pontifical function? So if we make a research, there's a methodological problem, whether it was written by someone to him or he wanted to say it himself. How to distinguish the two? Did he come with this idea? Well, we know that he loved person. His philosophy was personalism. So we know what he continuously insisted on. So I would suggest that, and I think that this citation and this recall of a pagan jurist was the idea of John Paul II himself. We have various translations, and we have the original text here. The original text from a lawyer who lived no later than the turn of the 4th century. From his book, his textbook in Roman law, that is Epitome of Law, Book 1. Therefore, since all law is established for men's sake, we shall speak first of the status of persons and afterward about the rest of the law, following the order of the Edictum Perpetuum and applying titles as nearly as possible compatible with these as the nature of the case admits. We always work with the text, and of course, we know that it's an excerpt. So first, we have to ask ourselves, what is the meaning of hominum causa? Is it a statement, a hypothesis? Is it a norm or a command, or just a conclusion as a regula? But what is important to us, in fact, to see the relationship between jus and homo, law and man, and our understanding of this. So we work with the text. When we work with the text, the interpretation of ancient texts will have at least two historical moments. First is the formulation of a sentence by a lawyer of the era of Emperor Diocletian. Well, in fact, Hermogenianus cooperated closely with the emperor, and we are almost certain that he drafted all his constitutions for year 293, 294. But the second layer is determined by the appropriation of the fragment for the Justinian compilation. So we have the same text for the beginning of the 4th century, but also the same text we have for the first part of the 6th century. So then we can ask about the meaning of these texts and the impact and the understanding of this text. The passage concerned, in Hermogenianus' view, an issue that was fundamental for every lawyer. That is how Hermogenianus himself viewed law. And of course, thinking about this, we might say, and as one of the hypotheses, is that he just formulated what is new in his textbook, in his manual to Roman law, that is Epitome of Law, is that he wanted first to discuss persons, and then to follow the order of Praetor's edict. But, and this quotation that we use now is justification for starting with persons. But we can ask ourselves whether we see more. So we ask, who was Hermogenianus, in fact, and what is the pagan context of his statements? and of his thoughts. What were his ideas about law? And in fact, we are here with problems of creating a biography, because we don't know much about Hermogenianus. We know that there was a code of Hermogenianus, Codex Hermogenianus, that was a collection of imperial rescripts issued in the eastern part of the empire over the 2 years, that is 293, 294. The question is, well, if he prepared that and it was a private collection, why this private collection was completed and why it has name of Hermogenianus? We know from Justinian compilers that Iuris Epitome, epitome of law, are to be ascribed to Hermogenianus. So we think, and this is the part of our research in Roman law and research in the sources of Roman law, that these epitome were prepared later than the code. They were prepared in Milan shortly after 310, and for sure before 315 or 320 as a summary of the law in force, because we know what were the regulations at that time, what is missing in this book, and what is present in this book. But then, of course, we tried to find the person. So there were rumors that this person, this lawyer, this jurist, was Eugene Hermogenianus, who appears among the prominent persecutors of Christians as a prefectus praetorio in the description of the martyr death of Saint Sabinus, Bishop of Assisi, of Spoleto, during the persecution by Maximian, in the early 4th century. So this is a question. A person cited by Roman pontiff was one who initiated persecution of Christians? Well, in Brescia in 1983, there was found an inscription inside a building from the 6th century, an inscription which mentions Aurelius Hermogenianus as a man operating at about the same time and place as our jurist. So probably Aurelius was our jurist and not a Eugene. But then we have another testimony about him. An eminent 5th century Christian poet, Sedulius, wrote with approbation, "Cognoscant Hermogenianum ductissimum juris latorem tres editiones sui operis confessisse." Let them know that the highly learned lawmaker Hermogenianus made 3 editions of his work. Then, of course, we, specialists in Roman law, discuss what does it mean 3 editions, whether there were editions like we prepare our books or editions that are just parts that he extended his collection. In fact, we know that Sedulius made more than 1 edition of his own work because he translated his work from poetry into regular text. So this is why he loved Hermogenianus, and he mentioned him with appreciation, and he mentioned him as author of the code and not of the textbook. But the textbook is very important to us. What is particular about Hermogenianus as a pagan lawyer, a pagan jurist, is that writing Hominum Causa de Personarum Status, for the first time, he used the notion of status that was used only for free people. He referred it to slaves, whose legal situation up to this moment had always been defined as conditio. So even in pagan literature, we have a switch at the beginning of the 4th century. The illustration is dying gold here in the Museum of Capitol Hill. But hominum causa omnibus constitutum sit sounds like a principle, especially if it's accepted and undoubtedly served Hermogenianus as a guideline for his systematics. But is it likely that he would use this at the beginning of the Iuris Epitome as the theme of a chapter on the legal situation of people with regard to the whole of law? So about use at lex and the relationship between law and man? Well, Hermogenianus cites this theme as if it were an obvious one, probably not only to readers, users, but also to himself. Therefore, the sentence, hominum causa, must have belonged to the accepted intuition of Hermogenianus' time and only found elegant expression in his voice. In fact, his does seem to be an important testimony. Even if Aurelius Hermogenianus was not an actual prosecutor of Christians, there is not the slightest indication that he belonged to the community. He wasn't Christian. Therefore, it must be recognized that hominum causa testifies to social beliefs that do not stem from Christianity. So this is a pagan context, and it's interesting pagan context. At best, they could be parallel to the convictions expressed by Christians in this society in which they lived alongside both Jews and Gentiles. So the centrality of person was a fixed point that had been unanimously accepted during the evolution of the Roman legal experience. And this is the result of our research in what was presented not only by him, but also what we know from the literature of Roman law. Hermogenianus, writing that, he made a major innovation, not only about slaves, but also about combining use with homines. We have this famous definition, the only definition that survived from Roman times, definition of law, that law is the art of what is good and just. And then this definition is cited by Ulpian, who was a century older than Hermogenianus, but then Ulpian, he made connection between rather use and justitia, that is law and justice. When Hermogenianus, almost a century later, made this important connection between law and man. And it seems to be, the postulate, it seems to be an important indication. So for us lawyers, it's obvious that present tense is also might also create a norm. So the conclusion is that it is man who creates the law and not the law that creates man. It might seem obvious to philosophers. It is not necessarily obvious to lawyers, not always, and not to every philosopher, as you know. And this is the part of our discussion. Of course, this is the part of our experience revealed by Roman law for legal anthropology. Roman legal experience continued to develop within Christian empire. So after Hermogenianus, that is the beginning of the 4th century, we have year 313, we have Emperor Constantine, and all the changes, and especially discussions that were made by another jurist, Tertullian. Tertullian, who used his framework of thinking, legal framework, to try to explain the Trinity and the mystery of Christ, whom we believe is true God and true man. And then Tertullian used hypostasis. Therefore, he thought in terms of persona, but not in terms of prosopon, that is a mask on a stage, but in a Roman way of thinking about persona, a person. And this is the experience that we have. So in the face of the turbulent Christological disputes, which were socially relevant as the source of divisions among 6th century elites, it was clear to these elites that Christ's persona was God who became man. In this way, humanity became valued per se. And this is what we have from the time of Boethius as well, because Boethius defines persona. And Boethius is very close, not geographically, but it's close in time to the compiler of Justinian. And we think about that in terms also of the regained unity between Constantinople and Rome just before Justinian. His uncle, Emperor Justin, restored that unity with Rome during his reign. So when we enter the time of preparing Digest and the Code of Justinian and Institute of Justinian that were textbook, we have unity between Rome and Constantinople. Hermogenianus' statement had a life of its own from the moment it appeared in the Epitome of Law, because it appeared then in the Digest of Justinian. It has been frequently noted that persona was always at the center of Karol Wojtyła's philosophy. Various allocutions of the Pope tended to suggest that there is no reason to stop at the philosophy of law, but theology of law is needed. Theology of law is needed. This would start from an anthropology, which sees a free and rational man in relation to the Creator. Under the influence of this anthropology, the law will find, at least in this sense, a correct concept of the human person, one that allows for consistently protecting democracy from steps which would turn it into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. So in fact, what we have behind it, and now, and why we cite Hermogenianus, and why we remember Centesimus Annus, and why we remember allocutions of the Pope, is the dispute over the essence of man. It seems that Marxists were not really prepared for this dispute, for this discussion in the 50s and the 60s. And in fact, what John Paul II comes to Rome with is this experience of the dispute with Marxists that we had in Poland, especially in the 70s. That he was aware of the discussion. Therefore, we have in this memory identity conversation at the dawn of a millennium the story that he tells about what happened in Poland. When the Communist Party came to power in the universities, every form of philosophical thought that did not correspond to the Marxist model was subjected to severe restrictions. And this was done in the simplest and most radical way, by taking action against the people who represented other approaches to philosophy. Foremost among those who were removed from teaching posts were the representatives of realist philosophy, including exponents of realist phenomenology like Roman Ingarden and also Isidora Domska of the Lviv Warsaw School. It was more difficult to deal with the exponents of Thomism, since they were based at the Catholic University of Lublin and theology faculties of Warsaw and Krakow at that time. Thomas was relegated from academic discussions for unscientificity and connection with religion or superstition, as Marxist says. The discursive acts determined the definition of scientific and unscientific. But idealism was banned totally, so Henrik Elzenberg couldn't act normally, as even Thomists were able to be present and in academic life in their activity. So Marxism made only a residual reference to phenomenology. We know that the main discussion was about anthropology, Homo contemplator versus Homo creator. And Marxists, when they started to think about anthropology, they started to develop this idea of Homo creator for various reasons. Matters of epistemology and the understanding of man were the key point of the discussions of the time. John Paul II, in his book, finds obvious what is not obvious for my generation after our education under the communist regime, because for us the Cartesian saying that cogito ergo sum, et non sum ergo cogito, non sum ergo cognosco, he said, well, we have to start, we have to restore what was before, so pre-Cartesian way of thinking. I am, therefore, I learn, I acquire knowledge, and I start to think about. So for me, particular book was this book cited here. That's an excerpt from this book, but about Marxist philosophy, Polish experience. The book was published here in Rome in 1987. And this is a collection of chapters, collection of, well, we might say, articles that are testimony of the experience of the debates that we had with Marxism in Poland or under communist rule. And I think it's quite instructive to understand why after 89, when Pope came to Poland, and then when he had this very special meeting with the Parliament of Italy, he mentions hominum causa as an important statement that makes us to think about anthropology in fact. So the core of the controversy was over anthropology and the understanding of man. This is how we can understand it, even being lawyers. Marxists consider man to be a social historical being who, in cooperation with other people, creates himself and in practice of everyday life, guided by basic life needs. It is man who creates his world, which is no longer a world of pure nature, but a human world. Ładoś writes, man has neither within himself nor outside of himself any ultimate meaning, goals, or values. Therefore, man himself creates the meaning of his life and gives its value. You understand that indicating Hermogenianus, who is pagan, not even Christian, who says, no, man creates law, not the law creates man, is very different. For Marxist, man is a biological being who co-creates himself and transforms his surroundings into things for himself. Everyone agrees that the present man is not happy, writes Kamiński, on our side, let's say. Therefore, they seek the liberation of man. Yes, Marxists. In fact, Kamiński gave only a draft of his article. He didn't make a full article in this book. Marxists, and as its anthropology observes, that man is constantly and has always been enslaved by his own creations and products. So man should be liberated from these products. Therefore, he should be liberated especially from religion, that is human creation. Okay, so if law is human creation, should man be also liberated from law? Well, Marxists wouldn't agree on that, because the Marxist positivism, well, they use positivism because it served the purpose. In our discussions, Marxism, in its doctrine and practice, will always tend to postulate the liberation of man from various dependencies. These will be primarily dependencies of God, on objective truth, on the unchangeability of human nature, an obfuscation of the truth about himself. Practice is to become the criterion of truth, wisdom of the stage, of the situation. Human freedom is knowledge and the ability to put it into practice by force or authority. According to the current Marxist conception of man, this is our observation on our side, the individual continues to face and adhere to society with the entire breadth of his being. He is a man, but a collective man, and not a man-person who is at least to some extent independent from society or superior to it. You know why Marxists wanted to ban also Roman law. In Thomism, man is the subject of action, while in Marxism, action will be the principle and source of man's subjectivity. Here we have the bell of St. Thomas Aquinas. And in fact, while it is clear that there is no society outside of people, Marxists also believe that there are no people without society at the same time, and therefore the relationship of an individual with society is dialectical. Quote, man has nothing human that he would not take from society. According to Marxists, that's what interests me here, man must be understood as part of a collective, a component, as in the Greek polis, where he loses his identity and separateness entirely to the community to which he is subordinate. Well, Roman law cannot agree with this. Individualism would be the opposite extreme here. It also leads to alienation, individualism. Well, but in Roman law, we also have this concept of domus. That is not really Greek oikos from polis, which is a place for staying, to sleep, to wash, to live, but domus as house, as home, where we live and we know our purpose. We think about ourselves. We try to understand why law is, what we create. So the anthropological significance of referring law to justice and law to man would appear to be universal. No doubt, it remains instructive also for democracy. So this is why we have the citation from Centesimus Annus, 1991. The relationship between man and law makes law a meaningful tool for the realization of human values and for serving man as an existing being prior to law. This relationship also points to man as a person, and so to the fact that this latter relationship that between homo and persona is an inquiry long overdue. So, being closer to the conclusions, I don't know whether you agree with me. You would agree. We will have discussion here and questions. But I think that today, anthropological heresy, being fundamental, is really dangerous. It's no paradox that the fundamental dispute with Marxism, which dominated political life for decades in the 20th century, also pertained to the vision of humankind. Therefore, when studying also who is a bearer of rights in a specific normative order, one cannot limit oneself to words only, not only to words. The 3rd century jurist, who may have been one of the people who initiated the persecution of Christians under Diocletian, let's take this hypothesis, stated simply that he first intended to focus on the law concerning people and only later on other matters. Because Justinian's compilers included this precept in their work of the 6th century, it helped promote the conviction that the law should be made for man's sake and that men should be pivotal to it. This statement thus formed part of the European legal tradition of a humanist trends. The dispute with Marxism in post-World War II Poland over the essence of man was proof of the centrality of man and not only for legal debates and regulations. On the other hand, we have Stanisław Kamiński's pessimistic remark. In Marxism, brotherhood and love is eschatological in nature, but it can take place only after the revolution has been won. Well, I started to study law in '88, so under communist regime, and I remember Marxist jurisprudence. I learned Marxist jurisprudence where revolution is a part of thinking about law. But in contrast, there is an anthropological significance of referring law to justice and law to man, which appears to be universal and indeed was revealed long ago by the pagan jurist of Rome. Their concept, Roman concept of persona as an individual who is a bearer of rights was and is to be accepted not only by those who are open to the Christian vision of man. Respect for human beings is indeed now and only in the future, and in practice everywhere, not only in societies committed to a democracy with truly human values. Neo-Marxism neo-Marxism seems to be a real danger today. This is also, or above all, the problem of anthropology. We remember what Hermogenianus said. We have this inscription of the pillars of the Polish Supreme Court. And we find this observation important. I think I'm quite convinced, and I don't know what you think, I'm convinced that legal experience as an experience of real life of a community, of life of individuals, because we have to regulate. So we have to know what is the reality. Not theories are important to us lawyers, but the reality of life and needs, because law is to regulate everyday life. Legal experience could be here helpful, could be of help to avoid errors. So please, do not think bad about lawyers. Do not think bad about jurists and their experience. Thank you.
Professor Longchamp de Brière, thank you very much for your lecture. And now we still have a time for questions, so please use the microphones.
Thank you very much, Father. Father, was there any concept in Roman law of the natural law? You mentioned that quotation there that man makes law, law doesn't make man. But is there a concept that law, in a sense, does make man, that the natural law makes him to be fully human? Was it just that there's just positive law, that these lawmakers make these laws, or was there something behind it? There's something more fundamental, something like the natural law in Roman law? Thank you.
To say, well, to use this expression, we can find this expression, jus naturale, in Roman legal texts. And this notion is particularly developed and discussed. We find it also in Gaius' works, that is between 140, 160 AD, obviously, and especially in the Severan dynasty lawyers, that is Ulpian writings. So then the discussions are about the nature, how they understood nature, whether nature is nature of all animals, so we are animals and we are part of this, or the nature is a special nature of human beings. But then, of course, we can think about it. But we can think about it also in terms of justice. That for justice in Roman law, there are two words that are used. One is justitia, that would be rather translated as rule of law. So we can think about positive law then. But then equitas. We might say equity, but we might say this is justice. So it's also, if you have fairness or equity, thinking about moral dimension, there's one way of understanding it. But justice and referring to justice, like all the research about, for example, abuse of law and whether we can find or discover a manifestation of reactions against abuse of law, like we have reactions to unjust enrichment, for example, in Roman law, and they are dispersed in different regulations, different situations, these reactions. So we can also, in this notion of equitas, find something that refers to what is anthropological in our understanding of law and what is just, what we consider just, not only fair, because there are elements that could, like hominum causa, before hominum causa, some regulations that might lead us to something that we could call procedural justice, for example. So if the saying that e incubit probatio qui dicit non qui negat. So the person who is going to prove is the person who states something and not the person who denies. It's obvious. It seems obvious. Like, it seems obvious that it's better that you are not judge in your own case. We think about it in terms of only the procedure, but in fact, well, we are not good judges in our cases. Of course, we basically know better than others what to do, but sometimes there are moments in which we really don't know. These are rare moments, but there are moments when we don't know. And it's better to ask someone from outside, better than to just to use a coin and to decide by fate what to do. Because the other person, the person from outside, might have different sensitivity, different view, less emotions. You know, medical doctors, when they perform operation, they don't perform these operations on their members of their own family. Because then, if something goes wrong, you live with this. So you ask your colleagues to perform the operation. So this is, and we now go out of just procedural dimension of justice in thinking about this. But also that we shouldn't make a process about, or trial about the same issue. If we did it once, that's enough. So these are notions of fairness. But that then we go out of this, we go further, and we find in Gaius' work, that is second part of the 2nd century AD, that we shouldn't abuse our rights, or we shouldn't use our rights in the wrong way. Or we have a statement taken from Roman law that even if something is allowed, it doesn't mean that it's honest. So these are the notions that direct our thoughts towards something that is behind, the values we agree on, but also what might be the anthropological dimension. And this is why we tend to track what you might call natural law, but it's very difficult to make this discussion starting from the top. We as lawyers, especially in private law, that we deal with contracts, with delicts, with law of succession, with law of property. We start with simple cases, and we ask, what are our reactions to certain solutions in a situation we have? Would we love to be a part of this, or we would decide it differently? And then we start, so the law has great potential for experience and for examples that are not abstract examples, but they come from everyday life. And we have this experience, like from Roman law, that starts not earlier than 12 tables, that is mid-5th century BC.
Thank you very much for your lecture. My question concerns a little bit the opposite direction. So because you spoke about the influence to some extent of Christianity on Roman law, so with this concept of person and this discussion concerning persona, but it has something to do in this process of development of this anthropological understanding of law you tried to present to us. As far as I understand, that you wanted, to stress that there is some connection. Tertullian is before the authors you spoke about. Yes. Anyway, it would be my expectation that there is something like this, because as far as I could understand, this Roman understanding of law is contractual. So we are just trying to be pragmatic and find rules for our common space, so to say. But well, so if you have some comments on that, I would be very interested in how according to your knowledge and your understanding, Christianity might have had some influence on this anthropological point you tried to present. And but my real question is coming from the opposite direction. So I would I would like to provoke you a little bit and ask you what, according to your understanding of Roman law, we lost, for example, in the practice of the Roman Church. What might we today rediscover on the basis of Roman law, for example, today? Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions and both questions. And well, thank you particularly because my idea was completely different. And I see I wasn't explicit about that. My idea is the concept of persona is primary. So it comes from, so before Christian era, we have this difference of understanding between Greece and Rome. Greece that perceives people only a part of a city, a town, polis. When Rome comes to the stage with their idea of persona, and this is primary to our Christian understanding, we used that and we enforced it. We made it we made it stronger. We made it stronger. So it was. So we had these instruments, these tools prepared by Roman law, Roman culture, Roman understanding of individuals. That come along with our understanding of our names inscribed in the Book of Life, that we are called by name. And then, of course, there's a huge discussion within the Roman law world of scholars about the influence of Christianity on Roman law or Roman law on Christianity. There is a book of 3 volumes of Biondo Biondi, Diritto Romano Cristiano. There are books. I recently prepared an article, a chapter about the only specialist in Roman law in Poland who sincerely believed in Marxism. There was a professor who graduated from Moscow University in 1911. He became professor in Russia in 1916. So we say pre-revolutionary Russia. It seems that the group he came out of was the group of pre-revolutionary liberals. He didn't return to Poland because he was born in Siberia. He was Polish, but he was born in Siberia. He came to Poland in 1923 or 1924, and he started to teach in Warsaw, in the Free University of Warsaw, Wolna Wszechnica, and also the University of Warsaw. But then, after the Second World War, he helped to create Faculty of Law of Łódź University, that's Central Poland. And just after Stalinism era, he wrote 2 books concerning Christianity, trying to prove that Roman ethics is completely different than Christian ethics, that we should return to Roman ethics, because Christian one is maybe humanitarian, but that is not humanist. He made several differences, trying to persuade that Christianity is theistic, but is not really personalistic. But missing one point, that is incarnation, and our understanding of Christ, who is God, who became man. Sometimes people like to study Roman law because they think this is a pagan experience, we can avoid Christianity, studying it. But, well, we are a Roman Catholic Church. Why? Because Roman Empire, in certain moment, started to consider Catholicism as its own faith. So, having all the Roman experience, the Roman experience was made Christian. It doesn't mean that all the society started to be Christian in our understanding of this. But then, in English, anachronism is always negative, I understood. So we use anachronistic way of evaluating what the changes that appeared at that time and what happened at that time. But this person, I referred to professor of law who was the only Marxist. He believed that, Boris Łapicki, he believed that when Christianity started to be connected with state, so especially in the time of Emperor Justinian and his compilation, Christianity lost even this humanitarian dimension. So there was, for the sake of promotion of faith or imposition of faith on others, that Christianity lost. So even this humanitarian dimension. Also, discussions were at the time of when Marxism was popular. We can be sure that this discussion will continue. And of course, in the realm of public law, that is organization of society, there is a lot to say about influence or power. But if we go down to what we say private law and what we really teach as Roman law, we call it like in epitome of law in this textbook or the institution of Ulpian, we talk about persons, marriage, contracts, torts, delicts. We talk about property, inheritance, and sometimes it's very difficult to show influence of any religion or ideology. Why? Because there is an anthropological experience that we have. Well, we are similar as human beings. We accept certain solutions, regulations, norms, and it seems to be quite universal. Therefore, law for this might be, an experience of law, might be also a way of checking whether our understanding of man is the correct one, and an understanding of society is the correct one. So I would say, if we return to the study of Roman law, if we return to the notion of Roman law, we start from simple examples, and one of the first one is that we should consider every person as a bearer of right. And then, what does it mean, really? Who is bearer of right? So we can return to our Christian understanding, and one of the fundamental questions that we have in the New Testament, who is my neighbor? You remember that there is nomikos. The nomikos is not one of Pharisees, scribes, of hypocrites. Nomikos, as St. Luke describes this person, comes to Jesus and asks, Master, what is the first commandment? The most important one. And he received an obvious answer. And then you might say, well, to divert attention from how simple was the question, he makes the fundamental question. Okay, but who is my neighbor? And then we have the story about the man who descended from Jerusalem to Jericho, who was robbed and left wounded. And then the concept of neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Is an immigrant my neighbor? Are Samaritans our neighbors? Are unborn children our neighbors? Are embryos? Every one of us here was an embryo. Are embryos our neighbors? How should we behave? And of course, we pass from that to the standard. We have a new standard, that is standard to love each other like Jesus loved us. So then, this is what Rome accepted. So it's an objective standard, not subjective, to love another like you love yourself. That is a part of natural law.
Sister Helen.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I was intrigued by what you said right at the end, that still Marxism is a very big threat to our understanding of the human person, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
And I would be intrigued to hear you say why, because I think there's obviously many threats to the human person today, but I wouldn't have put Marxism as one of them right now. So I'm interested to know what you meant by that. I could think of transhumanism, or I could think of gender or ideology, which I would say is as much to do with extreme liberalism as it is to do with Marxism. And of course, perhaps we could say the two things are connected. So maybe there's some interesting example you could give us that would help me understand better what you were trying to say. Thank you.
Well, any way of thinking in terms of opposition that we want to discover in our society and to create new stage by saying we know that opposition exists and there is some kind of progress. Because Roman law, especially Roman private law, shows that it's even difficult to talk about evolution there. We have some changes, we have some amplitude of changes, but if you are asked to say something about evolution of law or evolution of Roman law, as I was asked recently, I started to have problems with this. If you have an idea of progress, that you know that there is some kind of, that you can achieve new stages of development, but if you try to figure out that there are two classes that are in struggle, but you can say that there are women who need to struggle with men, young people to struggle with older, new generation, we are different, we should be treated differently, we should overcome, so we are open to revolutions. That might be dangerous because it's, for me, not really realistic from the point of view of the work of a lawyer. So whether we consider that as transhumanism, as ideas to fight for something that we know better, I consider it dangerous because I don't think that we really change as human beings very much. And that is what we are taught by the experience of Roman law, that we learn something new, some new regulation, and we say, oh, wait a second, we know that from somewhere. Like, what is the responsibility for artificial intelligence? The people say, well, let's think about the responsibility of owners for their slaves. If you have your own slaves and your slaves do something, they're intelligent, obviously. How are you responsible? Romans knew how to do that. I mean, if there are damages created, how you respond for that, how you can use intelligent, even objects, sorry to say that, but you know that Hermogenianus, pagan lawyer, started to consider slaves as humans, but Romans knew that from the point of view of a sacred law, everyone is equal. I mean, everyone is human being. The law that makes people different. This is why Gaius in the 2nd century says that there is a fundamental difference between men. They are free or they're slaves. I have a friend who says the fundamental difference between men is those who create currency and those who cannot create currency. Those who create currency can mint money, are those in charge, those who control others. The rest of us, so you can say, okay, we can struggle with those who create. So all these ways to think in terms of these classes, strata that are contradictory, well, Łapicki tried to, in the worst time of Stalin's tried to explain and to work on the relationship between slaves and slave owners. You can work on this. The beginning of the book is very difficult to be read. It's pure Marxism. The end is also not promising. But the analyses that are inside are quite instructive, although they are built to prove the thesis that there is a struggle. We have societies who are really divided. And we know that the struggle is not a way of promoting values or well-being. This is our experience also within law.
Professor Longchamp de Berrier, thank you again for the lecture. Thank you for these questions.
Thank you for questions.
Now, I would like to invite you, especially students, to an open seminar with Father Longchamp de Berrier, which will be held tomorrow, Friday, at 10:30 a.m. in Aula number 5. And now, very cordially, I'd like to invite you to the performance of Karol Wojtyła's play, A God's Brother, which was prepared by our students and under the direction of Professor Jarosław Kilian. The performance will take place at 6 p.m. in our church. Thank you very much.
Thank you.